You know what's interesting? Everyone has something to say about Gen Z and their phones. Everyone has a theory about millennials and their avocado toast. People talk about Gen X like some kind of quiet, forgotten middle child. But baby boomers, the generation born between 1946 and 1964, everyone thinks they already know them. And that's the problem, because the actual psychology of this generation, what really made them the way they are, is almost nothing like what gets said about them online. They're your parents, maybe, your bosses, the people at the diner who still tip in cash. The ones who don't understand why you need a therapist when you could just get on with it. And here's what nobody tells you. Their psychology is one of the most misunderstood of any living generation. Not because they're complicated, but because the world they were formed in has been completely forgotten. Picture this, it's 1955, you are 9 years old. The war your parents survived, the one that took uncles and rearranged everything, ended less than a decade ago. Your father doesn't talk about it. Your mother doesn't either. They just work. They just build. They just move forward. There is meat on the table tonight. Not always, but tonight. The television in the corner is a miracle. Everyone on the street has one now. The economy is growing faster than it ever has in American history. The future, for the first time in a long time, actually looks like a future. Boomers were the first generation in modern history to be born into deliberate optimism. Their parents had survived the Depression and World War II. They weren't going to let their children suffer. They were going to give them everything. And psychologically, that changes a person in ways that take decades to fully understand. Because you can't be raised on the promise of limitless possibility, on the idea that hard work actually does lead to prosperity, because your parents proved it, and then have the world quietly move the goalposts without it leaving a mark. Psychologists who study generational identity use a concept called formative cohort experiences. The idea that the events a generation lives through between the ages of roughly 10 and 25 become permanently encoded into how they see the world. Not just as memories, as assumptions. Sociologist Carl Mannheim first described this as generational units, groups of people who share not just a birth year, but a shared encounter with history that shapes their fundamental worldview. For boomers, that encounter was one of the most turbulent in modern history. Think about what happened during those years: the Kennedy assassination, Vietnam, the civil rights movement, the moon landing, Woodstock, Watergate, all of it compressed into roughly 2 decades. All of it happening while their brains were still figuring out what the world was supposed to be. Their parents said, "Work hard, trust the system, build something." And then in the same decade, they watched that system lie about a war, murder their president, and tell Black Americans they weren't equal. The psychological tension that creates doesn't go away. It just finds a home somewhere inside you. And that tension explains things about boomers that seem confusing from the outside. Take their relationship with work. Boomers work differently than any generation before or after them, and not because they're workaholics by nature. They were the first generation to grow up in post-war economic expansion, where the deal was real. You put in the hours, you got the house, the pension, the security. The contract made sense, it was provable, their parents proved it. Psychologists call this reinforced contingency learning. When a behavior is consistently rewarded during formative years, the brain doesn't just remember the behavior. It encodes it as a fundamental truth about how the world operates. So boomers didn't choose to believe in hard work the way someone makes a decision. They absorbed it as a fact, the way you absorb that fire is hot. Which is why when younger generations question whether the work-reward equation still holds, boomers can feel genuinely confused, not dismissive, confused. Because from where they're standing, the math still makes sense. It worked for them. Why wouldn't it work for you? What's harder for them to process is that they were the last generation for whom the math was universally true. The world changed. The equation broke down, but the encoding didn't. Then there's their relationship with privacy and emotion. Boomers grew up in households where feelings were, at best, a private matter. Their parents, the silent generation and greatest generation parents who had survived actual catastrophes, communicated love through provision, not expression. You didn't say, "I love you." You came home, you paid the bills, you showed up. Research in developmental psychology consistently shows that children raised in emotionally reserved households don't become emotionally absent adults. They become adults who express care through action rather than language. The warmth is there. The vocabulary for it often isn't. This is why boomers will fix your car without asking, drop off food without calling, solve the practical problem without ever asking about the emotional one. It's not that they don't care. They were never given a language for it. They are using the only one they were taught. And then there is the thing nobody talks about when it comes to boomers, the grief they carry from their own formative years. Because their generation didn't just live through optimism, they lived through the death of it. They were young when JFK was shot, young when MLK was shot, young when RFK was shot. Young when they watched their country send men their age into a war that turned out to be built on lies, and then watched those men come home to nothing. No parades, no support, no acknowledgement. An entire generation learned in real time that the things you believe in most deeply can be taken from you. Not gradually, suddenly, on a Tuesday afternoon on a television in a school gymnasium. Psychologists who study grief and collective trauma note that generations who experience repeated public losses during adolescence often develop what researchers describe as anticipatory resignation. A quiet internal bracing for disappointment that looks from the outside like cynicism, but isn't. It's armor, built from evidence. If boomers sometimes seem like they've already decided how something will turn out before it begins, that's where it comes from. Not pessimism. Pattern recognition earned the hard way. There's something else worth understanding. Boomers were the first generation to truly rebel, on a mass scale, against the world their parents handed them. Woodstock wasn't just a concert. The civil rights marches weren't just protests. The feminist movement of the 70s wasn't just policy. It was an entire generation saying, "The world you gave us is not good enough, and we are going to change it." That idealism, fierce, collective, real, is still in them. It didn't disappear, it just aged. It got complicated by mortgages and kids and decades of watching change move slower than hope does. But if you sit with a boomer long enough, you will find it. The person who marched, the person who believed, the person who thought the world was actually going to be different. Now, here's what would be doing you a disservice to leave out. Because there is a shadow side to all of this, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The same encoding that made boomers capable and resilient also made some of them inflexible. When the world you were raised in told you the rules were real and the rules worked, it is genuinely difficult to update that belief when the evidence says otherwise. Not impossible, but hard in ways that younger generations who were raised with more ambiguity find easier. The same emotional reserve that expressed love through action rather than words left real gaps. Children who needed more than a fixed car. Children who needed someone to ask how they were feeling and then actually wait for the answer. The same idealism that drove real change in the 60s and 70s did, for some, eventually calcify into a protectionism of what had been achieved rather than a continuation of what still needed to change. Not every boomer, but enough that it became a story the generation carries. The tragedy of any generation that came of age during idealism is that they have to find somewhere to put it when the world doesn't keep up. These contradictions don't cancel each other out. They're just true at the same time. But here is what gets missed in every generational argument about boomers. Every online complaint, every meme, every "okay boomer" that's become such a reflex that nobody stops to examine what it's actually dismissing. Boomers are the last generation who watched the world be genuinely rebuilt from rubble, not as metaphor, literally. Their parents came home from a war and built the middle class more or less from scratch. And boomers grew up inside that act of construction, absorbing the belief that human effort can genuinely transform things. That belief, worn down, complicated, sometimes wrong about how it applies, is still one of the most powerful psychological resources a person can carry. The knowledge encoded deep that things can be different, that they don't have to stay broken, that someone showed up and made them better once, and someone can do it again. They are not the generation that ruined things and left. They are the generation that genuinely thought they were fixing things, and then had to reckon with the difference between what they intended and what they built. That reckoning is harder than it looks from the outside. The truth is, every generation is a product of the specific whether they grew up inside. Boomers grew up inside a storm that alternated between the warmest sunshine and the coldest loss any generation had seen in a century. That weather made them hard in places where softness would have helped. It made them capable in ways that still haven't been fully appreciated. It made them idealists who had to learn to keep living after their idealism broke. And now they are aging in a world that talks about them mostly in complaints, in a culture that has decided it already knows who they are. In comment sections that use their name as shorthand for everything wrong, without stopping to ask what made them. Maybe the most honest thing you can say about baby boomers is this: they were handed the promise of a perfect world, lived long enough to discover that no such thing exists, and had to decide, every day after that, whether to keep showing up anyway. Most of them did, in their way, with what they had, with the emotional vocabulary they were given, which was small. They were not the architects of everything that went wrong. They were people, shaped by history, trying to build a life inside it, like every generation before them, like every generation that will come after. If this gave you something to think about, maybe something to say next time the conversation comes up, please subscribe.